Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the Carolingian Renaissance. The Carolingian Renaissance, and most specifically, we're going to be talking about a guy named Charlemagne. And this is for World Civ 1. So it's kind of a general overview of this period, and it will be on your next test. So it's important for you to pay attention. Most people have heard of this guy named Charlemagne, which is really essentially French for Charles the Great, but he's generally called Charlemagne, or in Latin it would actually be Carolus Magnus. So I'll be saying a little bit more about that. But let's look at this map first of all. So if you look at this map, you see what are known as the Merovingian kingdoms, or the Frankish kingdoms. Notice it takes up much of what would be Western Europe today, including almost all of what would be France, Belgium, parts of Germany, Switzerland, maybe even into parts of modern-day Austria. And this was the Germanic kingdoms that came after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And remember what we talked about before, we talked about a man named Clovis. He's generally considered the founder of the Merovingian dynasty. There were some before him. You can look that up if you're interested in more particulars. But he's very significant for a lot of reasons. Remember, we talked about that Clovis converted to Christianity also. So that's significant. But notice some of the old cities here. So you see Paris there. You see in the east Trier and Mainz and Cologne. Lyon in the south. Tours is an important one. So make sure you take a look at Tours there. We'll be talking about Tours. I have an ancestor that comes from Tours many years after this. But an ancestor that came to America from Tours in the 18th century. So there's Paris, as you can see, Tours. And I was mentioning all these places. So far east in Salzburg. So you have the origins of the southern German and Austrian areas there. So what was this Merovingian territory, the Merovingian dynasty? So the Merovingian dynasty, they were these Frankish kingdoms. The Merovingians were the rulers of these Frankish kingdoms. And as I said, we generally consider Clovis the founder of these kingdoms, although the name Merovingian goes back to an earlier king named Merovich. Remember, Clovis's name is a Latinized version of his name. He was actually his name was actually something closer to like Klovek. And the Merovingians were also known as the long-haired kings because they had long hair. And the Merovingian dynasty, under the Merovingian dynasty, you actually had, if we go back to the map, I'll show you this because you can see it in the map. There are actually different kingdoms that emerged. See, Neustria, Austrasia. In the south, you have Aquitaine and Burgundy here. And after Clovis's death, following most Germanic customs, property would be split among sons. And this happened. And then sometimes they would fight each other, sometimes one man or sometimes woman, and as the case may be, would emerge as a powerful ruler and rule the whole area. So that's kind of the general overview of that. What developed over time, you have, I guess we could think of it as kind of the beginning of nobility in a way. This area called a civitas. A civitas was an old Roman word. We could actually translate that as city. It's more like a county area. So it's more than just a city, like a metropolitan area maybe. And really they kind of arranged in a very loose way these kingdoms into these civitases, and they were usually ruled by different counts or nobility. The main guy in charge outside of the king was a position known as the mayor of the palace. And what happened over time, by the late 600s, so the late 7th century going into the 8th century, the mayors of the palace took on a lot of authority. And in many ways, the Merovingian kings, while they remained the kings, became figureheads, and the mayors of the palace had the real power. This is a coin from, I just got it off the Wikipedia article, in fact, a coin from the Merovingian period there. So, there was a new dynasty associated with one of these mayors of the palace, the Carolingian dynasty. Now, the most famous ruler of the Carolingian dynasty is the guy we know as Charlemagne. But Charlemagne's grandfather was a man named Charles Martel, whose name also would have been Carolus. So that's the name in Latin for Charles in English is Carolus. It looks like Carol with US on the end of it. So Charles Martel was one of these mayors of the palace, and he was the most powerful man in the Merovingian territories from 714 to 741. So he was really the guy in charge. That's a very stylized picture of him in the image there. That's actually from a 16th century print. He's very well known for the Battle of Tours. The Battle of Tours happened in 732. It was a battle between Charles and Muslim forces from Spain. Remember, there were Muslim armies that came across from North Africa and conquered the Iberian Peninsula in about 711. So they overthrew the Visigothic kingdom. And they set up I guess you would call it an emirate eventually, but this was the Umayyad family. We'll be or part of the Umayyad dynasty. We'll be talking about this when we talk about Islam, and that'll be after the Carolingian period. So this Muslim army comes north and is marauding, fighting, conquering. There's actually debate about this, but nobody debates that a battle took place. Then Charles Martel won the battle. Okay. Some emphasize this battle as being incredibly significant. Had it not happened, the Muslims might have conquered Western Europe. History would be a lot different. Others downplay that quite a bit, and some people come in the middle. So there's a lot more you can read about that. And there's still research going on, and scholars debate it. But that's one of the events that Charles Martel is very well known for. He's known for raising a pretty good army too. He started rewarding soldiers for fighting for him. We wouldn't call them knights in the later sense at all. They were more foot soldiers at that time. They did have some horses, but they didn't develop knighthood the way we think of it later. But mostly infantry, and he did reward them for fighting by giving them land. And that'll be important as the social structure develops in Europe later. So, Charles Martel dies in 741. His son, Pippin III, also known as Pippin the Short, becomes the new mayor of the palace. So it's interesting that the mayor of the palace had also become a somewhat hereditary position by this time. And he has a lot of power. Now, Pippin comes to the decision that he really wants to be king himself. And he actually writes a letter to a pope. I don't know if it's Zacharias or earlier pope. Don't remember off the top of my head, but it was Zacharias who anointed Pippin as king of the Franks. He writes to a pope and he says, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if the guy who's actually in charge and runs everything actually had the title king?" And the pope says, "Yeah, that's a good idea." So the Pope actually gives him essentially permission to retire the last Merovingian king. I think he went to a monastery or something like that. And he eventually meets, or this Pope Zacharias meets Pippin and anoints him as king of the Franks, giving them legitimacy, right, as blessed by God. So you have the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, blessing this event, right? So Pippin has a son. He had more than one son, but we're only going to talk about one for this lecture. And he died in 768. Pippin's son is the most famous Carolingian ruler, and his name was also Charles. I don't know if he was named specifically for his grandfather, but it makes sense that he would have been. But we know him as Charlemagne. And if you look at this map, you can see Charlemagne's inherited a pretty large kingdom. Now, at first, Charlemagne had a brother with whom he shared the kingdom. Basically, Charlemagne wins. If it wasn't a direct war, his brother dies, and Charlemagne becomes the uncontested ruler. Okay, that's probably the simplest way to put it for this lecture. But Charlemagne adds to that Frankish kingdom and expands it, particularly, as you can see, in the north, where we see Saxony, conquers that area and adds it, in the east and the south. So he goes further into Eastern Europe and northern Italy, and most of Italy, in fact. Oh, let me mention this other thing that's very important. If you see this area right here, this is an area that becomes known as the Papal States. Pippin granted that territory to the Pope. And basically, he said, you can have that territory, and I'll back you up on it militarily. And Charlemagne did that too. Now, the Pope's claim in a forged document, or we know it's forged now, people in the Middle Ages believed it was real, and that document was called the Donation of Constantine. And that document claimed to be a statement by Constantine himself from the 4th century giving the Western Roman Empire to the popes. We know that document was a forgery. But in the Middle Ages, and it was probably forged during this time period to justify these events. But in the Middle Ages, people believed it was an authentic document. Nonetheless, the Papal States will play a significant role in European history and Italian history, and they're still a Papal State. The Papal State today is essentially the Vatican itself. Again, simplifying that a little bit, but that's basically what happened.